Right. So today, everyone, this is the session on legal advocacy training support for B, which is about organization forms. Um, we only have currently Kenisha Hewitt of the Association of Caribbean Copyright Societies. At present, today's session should cover a review of the key policies and regulatory frameworks dealing with youth, HIV, AIDS, gender, culture in the Caribbean. And it will also look at the Sustainable Development Goals and its implementation in the Caribbean. And we're going to look at the sustainability of the various policies and regulatory operations in terms of CSO advocacy. That aspect we may not be able to do as much today because it requires you to be able to go back and forth with me about your particular advocacy strategy having regard to the stuff that I said. Now, copyright doesn't quite fall under these categories, but maybe under the development goals, we can see how that relates
Okay.
to the work that your organization does.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so since it's your loan, I will look at identifying maybe some specific gaps in the legislative framework in relation to to these issues. Look at some target areas that you could probably look at, but this is not going to be as much for you because this is not your particular area. But
That's
after I
okay. I will
presented
learn,
you,
I am sure.
maybe you can discuss your specific organization, the type of work you do, and then we can go about that. Because if it's about copyright, of course, I'm an attorney, and part of that work that we do um, is on intellectual property.
Right.
So we can have some discussion about that as well.
Mhm.
I don't know if you have been in any of these before, but just to indicate, my name is Westman James, and I am an attorney at law in Barbados, Belize, and Trinidad. I'm from Trinidad, but I live here in Barbados, and I lecture at the University of the West Indies, where I'm a lecturer at the law faculty.
Okay.
Right. Now, one of the things that we're going to look at is HIV and AIDS. Now, as we know in the Commonwealth Caribbean, HIV and AIDS, we have the second highest prevalency of HIV and AIDS in the world. We This is after sub-Saharan Africa, and there may be a number of reasons for that. There is an organization in the Caribbean, the CARICOM and PANCAP, that actually looks at the regional response to the HIV and AIDS epidemic. Of course, HIV/AIDS are nowhere where it used to be. However, it is still an issue for that of the Caribbean, and there's a lot of CSO work of surrounding the issues of HIV and AIDS in the Caribbean. But just to highlight maybe some of the legislative gaps there are about HIV and AIDS has to do one with discrimination. Now, most of the constitutions of most of the Commonwealth Caribbean countries do not make reference to HIV/AIDS as a ground upon which you cannot discriminate. They don't have HIV or status, HIV/AIDS, or sexual orientation. Most of them do not have that. In Jamaica, since you are from Jamaica, the discrimination section speaks to male and female, and there are a number of other grounds, but neither one of these two things. That's a legislative hindrance sometimes in relation to the fight against HIV and AIDS, because as we know, discrimination on the basis of HIV and AIDS is the stigma and discrimination is what helps drive the epidemic, because patients would not want to get tested. They go underground, they don't disclose, and then they take more riskier behavior. So that's one of the issues surrounding HIV and AIDS. Oh, hi Wendy. Thanks for joining us. Um, So far, we only have Felicia in relation to this class. The other aspect of HIV and AIDS is ordinary laws do not cater for non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or HIV status. The only countries who have anti-discrimination legislation, you know, Trinidad and Tobago has anti-discriminatory legislation. However, it specifically excludes the concept saying that sex does not include sexual orientation, and they do not have HIV/AIDS as a prohibited ground of discrimination under the Equal Opportunities Act. In fact, many advocates have been in CSOs such as Colin Robinson from CAISO about the change and been trying to lobby for amendments to the Equal Opportunities Act in Trinidad to include HIV status and age as grounds, prohibited grounds for discrimination. So there isn't that in the Caribbean, which or anti-discriminatory legislation, which prohibits some of these particular aspects of in the HIV epidemic. Broad-based non-discrimination and equality legislation exists only in relation to employment in relation to certain countries. So Trinidad and Tobago's anti-discrimination legislation, Equal Opportunities Act, is a little bit wider. It speaks to work, services, and goods, emission of goods, but in most of the other countries, it is only in relation to employment. You can see that in St. Lucia. You can see that in Barbados. In the Employment Rights Act in Barbados, if you dismiss someone because of their HIV status, you have to pay extra for wrongful dismissal. You have to, I think, up to 2 years of salary. Sorry, 12 months, a cap of 12 months of salary that you can get, because on top of your compensation for the fact that you were terminated on a number of grounds, one of them being HIV status. But you would find that might be sometimes in the legislation dealing with employment rather than broad-based legislation. In the Bahamas, is the only Caribbean country where anti-discrimination provisions in the Employment Act make reference to HIV as a basis for non-discrimination. That might not, what I just said, in Barbados, it says that if it is that it does on the grounds, you would get more money. But Bahamas as well has anti-discrimination provision as Employment Rights Act, which makes reference to HIV, but that also includes Barbados. Now, the Bahamas restricts entry, stay, and residence for HIV positive people, while Belize, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago have specific laws criminalizing HIV transmission. So this is part of the regulatory framework surrounding HIV/AIDS. The Anglophone Caribbean maintains some of the most regressive anti-gay laws in the world. All of the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean, that is, except for the Bahamas, who by legislation decriminalized same-sex intimacy a long time ago, but by judicial decision, for Belize and Trinidad and Tobago, laws which prohibit same-sex intimacy has been struck down as being unconstitutional. So the rest of the country still have laws which prohibit same-sex intimacy, and that includes Jamaica, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts, St. Vincent, Grenadines, and so on. And Guyana, you find that In those jurisdictions, you can go to jail for sometimes up to life imprisonment for committing either burglary or what might be considered to be carnal intercourse against the order of nature or some other variation of the same. And that has been shown to increase and or the prevalence of HIV and AIDS in those jurisdictions. In Belize, where the Caleb Barroso case was litigated dealing with same-sex intimacy, the state had raised this issue of that HIV and AIDS would spread if you allow same-sex intimacy. And the statistics was showing that it's when you actually have those laws that it increases HIV and AIDS prevalence in that country because it drives people on the ground. They don't want to disclose it to their doctors. They don't want to get tested and so on because they're afraid that of the stigma and discrimination. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, there was, and Belize had specifically had legislation which said that you were prohibited entrance from the country if you were a homosexual. Specifically, you could not come into the country if you were not a homosexual. This was dealt with in the case of Maurice Tomlinson versus the state of Barbados and the states of Trinidad and Tobago and Belize, where the court is saying that CARICOM nationals cannot be discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation when they enter into other countries. So that even though that law was there on the books in Trinidad, it was not being applied, and in Belize, they're saying that it only applies in very limited circumstances. So you see that even in those countries, that it is even more difficult for persons who are exposed or maybe key populations in the fight against HIV. With the exception of Suriname, Caribbean countries also prohibit activities related to sex work, including soliciting, living off of earnings, loitering, wandering in public, procuring for the purposes of prostitution, and using a premises as a brothel. Those kinds of issues also affect and contribute to the prevalence of HIV and AIDS within the Caribbean. So that's some of the legislative framework in relation to HIV/AIDS in the Caribbean. If I go on to maybe youth, do you have any questions surrounding, this issue? You would find, as I should say as well, that a lot of the HIV responses in country have been either dealt with by the Ministry of Health in those jurisdictions, like in Barbados, or that they are advocates through the polyclinics and NGOs.
No, I have no questions so far.
Okay, great. So the next area that we look at is in relation to youth and how what is the legislative framework within the Caribbean on youth and how they dealt with within the Caribbean. And so there's a number of CSOs dealing with youth affairs, and many CSOs incorporate young people in relation to the particular area. They make sure and speak to issues dealing with young people. Now, CARICOM had sought to deal with or the issue of youth participation in our society. In fact, led by the Council for Human and Social Development, COSOD, A commitment to regional youth in its time for action plan, CARICOM nations states developed a regional strategy for youth development and improving the situation of youth through targeting persons. They had established mechanisms to provide youth with a voice in policy making, statistical disciplines to collect and analyze quantitative and qualitative data, establishment of systems for training and educating youth workers, establishment of national youth commissions, implementation of institutional community-based programs, implementation of community-based projects, other efforts by CARICOM to address youth issues included, they created youth ambassadors. They have model CARICOM conferences for young people, support for cooperative initiatives such as the Australian Caribbean Community Sports Development Program. So that's some of the work in relation to CARICOM. In relation to some of the legislative framework, in relation to young people, you would find, first of all, in international law, that many of our Caribbean countries have signed up to many international agreements which specifically deal with issues of young people. Okay, and one of them, and the most important of those international treaties, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is one of the, all of the Caribbean countries have ratified the Conventions on the Rights of the Child. Okay. I've also collated some of the other international treaties that deal with issues of young people and youth in this chart, and looking at, and let's put them to see some of the responsibilities and the legal obligations of the countries in relation to young people. So as you see there with Antigua and Barbuda, the abolition of the slave trade, institutions and practices similar to slavery, issues of consent to marriage, minimum age for marriage, registration of marriages, convention on the minimum age for admission, institution and practices similar to slavery, night work of young persons industry, ILO conventions, and for Barbados, child marriages issue. So you see a number of countries, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, who has the medical examination of young persons, see abolition of medical examination of young persons, ILO convention, slavery, slave trades, social and cultural rights in relation to young persons, a number of other things besides the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there are a number of these conventions and international treaties that the states have signed up to, which ensures that young people have access to some of the fundamental human rights that we have talked about. In terms of youth, their health in this regard, the spread of HIV and AIDS is a particular concern, especially since a byproduct of specific cultural practices, which include but not limited to early sexual initiation in the Caribbean. It's considered to be that the average age of sexual initiation in the Caribbean is some of the earliest in the world. And our average age is 11 or 12 years old, where persons first initiated into sex. And that is, and half of that initiation is through force. And half of those persons, and so those are some of the statistics in relation to Caribbean, in relation to initiation of sex. So it's because of some of those practices that we have issues of HIV. And besides that, in terms of there's incest, and that the legislation in the Caribbean in relation to incest is somewhat left to be desired, where it is that sometimes stepfathers and so on is not considered to be incestuous, and so therefore, can avoid legal ramifications, sexual abuse, transactional sex. And then recently in Trinidad and Tobago, there was child marriage that was allowed. They finally passed legislation which outlawed the ability of persons as young as 12 years old in Trinidad to get married. So young people, those are some of the issues in terms of health. In terms of education, there are disparities in the access to quality education. Gendered perceptions of its usefulness still remain as a challenge to youth in the Caribbean. You have high dropout rates generally, and attrition and performance challenges for males specifically. We see especially that when, for example, young girls get pregnant, they are not allowed to go back to school. You would find that I think Jamaica has a good program about ensuring that those girls still get an education and are reintegrated into school. So those are some of the issues surrounding youth in the Caribbean. Poverty, so socioeconomic disabilities of youth prevent many older youth from establishing their independence from their parents, thereby retarding their transition to adulthood. And we've seen how youth unemployment is staggering in the Caribbean, is that our young people are unable to get jobs, where they are unable to provide for themselves and still rely on their families and their parents up to this day. Crime and violence, exposure to violence and abusive circumstances have led to levels rage among young people being extremely high. Antecedents for involvement in gang-related and antisocial behavior activities. You also see as a part of crime and violence and also health, the mental health issues in relation to young people. There's a record number of young people identifying that they are depressed, and so those require some aspects of intervention in relation to youth within the Caribbean. Right, crime and violence, and so recreation, the lack of leisure facilities throughout the region there towards the development of youth, decreases their opportunities for social involvement. So these are some of the issues that surrounding young people. Also, another major issue in relation to young people are issues of sexual and reproductive rights. And you would find that there are barriers to accessing sexual and reproductive health services in the Caribbean, whether it's through legislation which provides that a person who is not yet 18 cannot, without the parental consent, get medical treatment. However, the common law has developed where they allow persons who are younger to maybe able um, to get medical treatment and so on. Um, so the barriers, some of the barriers also include the ability of you know, to sex intimacy, HIV, AIDS, discrimination, and the lack of just non-discrimination on the basis of age, which allows a bar presents barriers for young people in order to live to their full potential. Also, access to services and commodities. Sometimes persons are unable, or young people are unable to obtain birth control, other sexual and reproductive health services, whether it be termination of pregnancy and a number of other things, which is should be accessible to young people. And so they have some issues on that. In terms of legislation as well, we see that it doesn't allow some of the legislation within the Caribbean does not allow young people or persons who have a sexual relationship with young people to face the brunt of the law if they say that they are, they don't believe that, or they have a reasonable belief that if the person was over the age of 18. Other issues in relation to young people includes the access to effective sexual and reproductive health education. You will find that sexual and reproductive health education in the Caribbean is not dealt with in school. Age-appropriate sex education, or it's called FLE. Jamaica was one of the pioneers in trying to do this, but they saw the pushback from the public when they saw the workbook and where to deal with some of these issues. And there are issues dealing with education and sexual and reproductive health. You have certain schools who are religious domination schools, prohibiting the discussion of this aspect of sexual health being discussed at school. So there are a number of these issues dealing with sexual and reproductive health, which young people face today that are not necessarily being dealt with. The other aspect we're looking at in terms of the general space for CSOs is gender. Now, the following is the regional framework and some instruments and strategies that are currently being used to advance gender equality of women, especially empowerment of women in the Caribbean. You would have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, Convention of Bellum de Para, which is an inter-American convention on prevention and eradication of violence against women. And this actually came out of and all follows the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, but I think goes a little further. Then the CARICOM Plan of Action 2015-2019 deals with gender equality and empowerment of women. The United Nations Multi-Country Sustainable Development Framework, the CARICOM Integrated Strategies and Framework to Reduce Adolescent Pregnancy. A number of initiatives within the Caribbean that we're dealing with women and gender equality. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979, or called CEDAW, certainly commits states to taking all appropriate measures, whether it be legislation or otherwise, to ensure the full development and advancement of women for the purposes of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms on a basis of equality with men. So that's one of the main pillars of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It provides a number of other things, women being in politics, women being able to do control of their own body, and a number of other things that are important in relation to women. So that's one of the conventions that we are part of. The Beijing Platform for Action of 1995, signifies the governments who signed on their commitment to advance the goals of equality and development and peace for all women around the world. And it was the outcome of the Fourth World Conference on Women, which was held in Beijing, China in 1995. Now, the Beijing Platform for Action obliges governments to address its 12 critical areas of concern as priorities where it comes to women. The revised Treaty of Shangri-La's within the Caribbean also provides for the operational guidelines for the functions of the community, the CARICOM Secretariat, and the CARICOM Single Market for the Economy. And in Article 17.2, it outlines the functions and powers of the CSOs. In particular, it shows that subject to the provisions of Article 12, CSOs shall be responsible for the promotion of human and social development in the community. In particular, CSOs shall establish policies and programs to promote the development of youth, which is a part of youth part as well, and women in the community, with a view to encouraging and enhancing their participation in social, cultural, political, and economic activities. So you see, even the revised Treaty of Shangri-La gives a role to an organ of the Caribbean community in order to ensure the development and promote the development of women and young persons. So it's a legal obligation of the state under the revised Treaty of Shangri-La. In CARICOM, there's also the CARICOM Charter of Civil Society, which, while not a binding treaty, is a document which gives some meat to some of the objectives of the revised treaty and so on. And one part of that is that CARICOM Charter lays out principles by which government commit themselves to respect and strengthen fundamental elements of its civil society. And one of them is women's rights. And so for the promotion of policy of measures aimed at strengthening gender equality, all women have equal rights with men in political, civil, economic, social, and cultural spheres, and such rights that include the right to be elected, to be appointed to public office, be eligible for appointment to positions of decision-making bodies at all levels of the society, not to be discriminated against by reason of their marital status, pregnancy, lactation of health, and so on, to legal protection, including just and effective remedies against domestic violence, abuse, and sexual harassment. So you would see that in a number of countries like Barbados, past sexual harassment and exploitation, albeit in Barbados it's in relation to the work that, which is something that has been taking women for a long time. And so Barbados, they dealt with, sexual harassment and the responsibility of the employer in relation to women. But there are still some discriminatory laws which are affecting women and the rights of women. So in Barbados and in the Bahamas, they have non-discrimination provisions that do not include sex as a prohibited ground of discrimination. That would have adverse effects on women in relation to, sorry. So in relation to Barbados and Barbados and the Bahamas, their constitutions specifically do not provide for prohibition of discrimination against women, and that can be a problem. We also see that in those two jurisdictions, there's also an issue of women not being able to give their nationality to their children and that persons can only be obtain Bahamian nationality through their father. And the Barbados had that same provision as well, but it was amended. So you see that even in constitutions within the Commonwealth Caribbean, that gender was also sex was and women's rights were not being fully realized. Now, gender is far wider than sex, and of course, I've already spoken to some of the issues in relation to gender, whether it be sexual orientation, gender identity, that there aren't the provisions for their protection in the Caribbean. So those are two other things. So that's in relation to young people and some gender issues that surround the Commonwealth Caribbean and the space in which CSOs operate within the Caribbean. Any questions so far? And do you?
Yes, I have one. Going back to slides 9 to 11, where you talk about youths and the instruments ratified. Is there any or are there any adverse uh, effect as it relates to specific countries? For example, you have the Bahamas with two named instruments there, as opposed to Barbados that has eight. So, in I'm asking, does Barbados are they in a better light, so to speak, than Bahamas with the amount they have,
Well,
as opposed to
okay.
Bahamas?
Right. So some of these conventions and so on have to do with specific things, but everybody is signed up to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's one of those conventions which has taken effect of almost customary international law. So everybody is still required to comply with those obligations, and so that brings everybody on the same kind of playing field. These are some other things which have effects on youth that those countries have actually signed on to. But because everybody else has signed on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they would be captured by anything that those other things might pose.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Right, the last thing that I want to look at before we just have a normal discussion would be the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, also known as Global Goals, was adopted by the UN in 2015, or UN member states, and it's a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Now, the objective was to produce a set of universal goals that met with huge and environmental, political, and economic challenges facing our world. And so it sets out 17 goals for the world's future through to 2030, and they are backed up by 169 detailed targets that are to be met by member states under those heads. They were negotiated over a 2-year period by United Nations. They were agreed to by nearly all the world's nations, but it is not legally binding. It is where it is that states should be, and they are given quite large autonomy in deciding what it is that they to do. The SDG goals or SDGs are supposed to be universal, so it applies to every nation, every sector, cities, businesses, schools, organizations, and so everybody is challenged to act under the SDGs. Every aspect of society should be involved, and so therefore it's universal. It's also integrated, where it is that all of them are interconnected. All SDGs are interconnected in a system, and so you can't really achieve just one goal you have to achieve them all because you can't have one sometimes without the other. So it's important to have them integrated. And transformation, and it's widely recognized that if you achieve these goals in making very big fundamental, you need to make big fundamental changes so that we can all live on the planet. And so therefore you need to pass legislation to bring some of these things into effect and to ensure that the SDG goals, well, SDGs are realized. And so what I have here now are the SDGs. So you have one is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, end hunger. Two is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Three is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being of all at all ages. So here you see that there's issues of youth. Ensure inclusive and quality education for all and promote lifelong learning, which we have already indicated is part of the young or youth issues as well. Five is to achieve gender equality and empower women and girls. So here is one of the state's tasks with ensuring and complying with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women by ensuring that there is gender equality and that women are empowered. Number six, ensure access to water and sanitation for all. That, as you see, is a major aspect of our countries, even now where there be water scarcity, to ensure that everyone has access to water. Seven is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Number eight is to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent growth for everyone. Nine is to build resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. So now it's not only gender, but also among countries, whether it be developed nation or and underdeveloped nation and so on, everybody should be equal. And so it is a goal of the SDG. So one of the SDGs is to ensure that there is some sort of equality there. 11 is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. Again, a very topical issue in relation to us currently in this world and us in the region who are very prone to hurricanes and adverse weather conditions. 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the ocean seas and marine resources. 15 is sustainable management, forest combats desertification, forest and reversal land degradation, and all biodiversity loss. So again, dealing with the environment. So that the Brazil incident comes to mind in relation to that SDG. Number 16 is to promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. Just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. So one of our obligations, as a state, is to do that. And 17 is to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So these are some of the SDGs, as you see it, put them in thing, which is goal one is no poverty, goal two is zero hunger, goal three is good health and well-being, goal four is quality education, goal five, gender equality, six, clean water and sanitation, seven, affordable and clean energy, eight, decent work and economic growth, nine, industry, innovation and infrastructure, while goal 10 is reduce inequality. So each goal is an importance in itself, and they are all connected. So it is not just you can go and pursue one and not the others. They are all interconnected.
Who monitors these goals?
The UN themselves. So it's supposed to be because it's not binding. It's it's each each region, each state is supposed um, to provide an update on their achievement of the SDGs. So it's by way of reports.
So if say for example, uh, the layman or anyone who
Correct.
thinks that the one of these goals is not being
Yeah,
met
they do.
or being violated, who does the layman report to?
Right.
Since
So it would have to be
mhm.
their own internal state sort of resources or mechanisms. That's why CSOs are important because CSOs can then make reports to the international agencies when these states are sending up their reports. So CSOs can do shadow reports where they are actually saying, no, well, that's not how it really working. On the ground, this is what is happening. But there's no enforcement mechanisms per se in relation to the SDGs. They're really goals that states are committed to try to meet by 2030.
Oh, so have you seen or heard of any instances where uh, a goal, for example, has been reported as not being, I guess, fulfilled by any of the anyone from within the I guess any country, whatever it is,
Yes,
that have
yes, you would
actually
see.
brought it up?
Yes, so what you would see is that some states would say, yeah, look, we have until 2030 to do this. So this is where we are at. Our poverty levels are reduced. They're more lower in unemployment, stuff like that. But they have not say, oh, it has all been met, and so there's no um, more obligation. It's none of that.
Okay. Have there been any sanctions against any of the
No, because it's not a binding document, no, there's no sanctions. They would have to go to the specific treaties, like Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Sudan Convention, where you can report a state in relation to those treaties. And those committees can determine that a state has been violating the treaty and impose some sort of sanction.
Okay.
All right, so that's really the main structure of the presentation. Now I want to hear a little bit about your NGO, the space in which you work, and any questions you may have in relation to that about CSOs and your CSO in particular in relation to human rights, and just what's happening around, that sort of thing.
There is a feedback. Um,
It might be the fans, sorry.
oh, okay. I didn't hear the question you asked.
So I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your CSO and any questions that you may have in relation to it and the space in which you are working.
Well, see, so in relation to my company itself,
That's correct. Yeah.
well, I would consider, all right, let me tell you exactly what it is we do as it relates to civil service. We mostly represent persons in the creative industry.
Mm-hmm.
So we generally administer their copyright in the works they create. So we collect on their behalf royalties that's generated in the public for them. But what we have done, in which we consider our civic duty, is to provide information to our respective shareholders, whether they're the songwriters, etc., because we know that there isn't much attainable information in the sector as it relates to formalities. So they're very informal in Jamaica. So we
Yeah.
try to educate that sector, letting them know what's happening on a global perspective and how they can, in turn, use the information to, I guess, gain more benefits from their intellectual property that's already out in the public. Um, so, from that standpoint, that's where we are as it relates to guiding persons on what to do or how to do whatever it is in relation to providing or getting some benefits from their intellectual property, so to speak.
Right.
Hmm.
And so that's good. So that involves a number of things. One, that you set up as a limited liability company
Hmm.
as opposed to a not for profit organization,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And so on the last class we kind of dealt with that. We talked about difference between those two. We looked at some of the legislation in Jamaica as well. So that would have been good for the students to hear that look, there's a different way to do it, and your members are shareholders because it operates by the Copyright Organization of Trinidad and Tobago, correct? So your
Right.
members are
Hmm.
shareholders,
Right.
and so on. So that's also a good thing. And in terms of the legislative framework in relation to copyright and so on within Jamaica, are there pitfalls and or gaps that you can identify?
Well, there are, as it relates to how we operate, definitely there are gaps there. Right now, our copyright or act speaks to licensing bodies and not necessarily the copyright society themselves. So we have
Mm-hmm.
to now be careful in terms of what we put out to the public, and they have to understand what the licensing body actually represents or what it entails. So in the act itself, you might have persons that are challenging us based on that word. So there are gaps. What we have done recently is to increase the life of copyright in Jamaica. So they have amended the act there in 2015. So it moved from, I believe, 50 years to 95 years. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that has happened for us in Jamaica. But we have to use the Copyright Act in anything we're doing, especially for those stubborn music users who do not want to be compliant in getting out those their licenses as music users in order for the creators to earn. So, I mean, it's a challenge and we're still fighting that battle, but we have to do it just the same.
Right. So okay, cool. And so that's kind of, yes, looking at some of the sort of things. And what have you all been doing about some of those legal gaps? Have you all been getting the government to draft legislation to amend it? Are they receptive to that?
Well, they are receptive. We have been lobbying. We have JIPO, Jamaica Intellectual Property Office,
Yes.
who actually, I guess, what would you call it now? I think Trinidad has the equivalent.
Yes.
Equivalent. Um, don't remember what the term is, but they have been lobbying on behalf of the CMOs in Jamaica as it relates to uh, getting those copyright issues dealt with for us.
Right.
So we are continuing to have that support there, and the government, they are receptive. It's just that it takes time. So
Right.
that's a factor. It takes years for these things to come through and be passed, etc. So I guess we just have to wait just the same.
Right. Okay, good. So that's kind of how your the space that you all are in. Any questions, Amita?
I'm good. I'm good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being my sole student today. I hope you learned some stuff. Um,
Okay. Yeah, it has been good, and I've learned a lot.
all right, great. All right, so enjoy the rest of your night. I'm going to sign off and stop the
Okay.
recording now.
All right.
So
Thank
take care.
you.
No
Mhm.
problem.